Let's get one thing clear. This movie is animated. Disney did not wrangle a bunch of lions onto a set, although admittedly if they had done that, I would be totally on board with this movie, 100%. But no, this film is created by Animators. So the reviews have come in for Lion King 2019, and lots of critics are complaining about the uncanny valley and their general inability to connect with the characters on screen. CNBC summarizes the criticisms by saying, "The hyper-realism seems to be at odds with the musical elements, something the 1994 version was able to bypass by having anthropomorphic cartoon animals." I'm sorry, CNBC, just stop. The Lion King wasn't bypassing hyper-realism. Nobody was sitting around in 1994 saying, well, Jurassic Park just came out, why don't we use that same technology to make our movie about singing lions? That wasn't something anyone considered for a second, probably because they thought it would be a horrible idea. They only had to wait 25 years to find out that they were right. It was a horrible idea. At least if they had made it in the 90s, it would be a gloriously shitty early 3D cartoon like this. And the reviewers have not been kind to this movie so far. You've probably also seen all sorts of tweets from hobbyists and professional animators talking about their distaste for the movie. Lion King specifically seems to be getting a lot of criticism, more so than some of the other recent Disney remakes. And while I'm not personally a fan of this recent trend, I can at least acknowledge the appeal of having human actors in a film starring humans. I mean, I personally find the cartoon Aladdin to be much more appealing than this guy. But everyone's different. Kids generally love cartoons, while most adults find it difficult to empathize with animated characters, at least to the same degree that they empathize with real actors. And also there's this general stigma in American culture about cartoons, which is that they're primarily for children, unless they're aimed solely at adults, like, Adult Swim. So Disney took advantage of this. They looked at current trends, they whipped up the Jungle Book. No, not that one. There we go. Jungle Book 2016. I guess technically they made Maleficent and Cinderella first, and it seems Disney's been interested in this trend for a while, with plans for a live-action Mulan going all the way back to 2010, which would have been only 12 years after the original. But Jungle Book really cemented the whole trend of we're gonna do the talking animals movies. 3 years later, Disney has gone full MCU with their lineup of remaking the classics. This year there are 5, count them, 5 remakes in the live-action style. Dumbo, Lion King, Aladdin, a Maleficent sequel, and a Lady and the Tramp remake. What? How did I just now find out about this? Uh-oh. Exclusively on Disney+. Well, hey, at least they're real dogs. God, I love movies with talking dogs that just have real dogs running around on set. They're just so cute and pointless. Bonus points for really shitty lip sync. Anyway, so this is where we're at. 3 of these movies have already gotten their Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic scores determined, and it really seems like Disney's new flagship series of movies is kind of headed for disaster. While they've been on a steady streak of commercial and critical success up to this point, these kind of scores could result in a decline in box office revenue going forward. While they're not exactly in, Batman v Superman territory, which pretty much sunk the entire DC cinematic universe, all 3 of these films so far have scored lower than any of Disney's Star Wars movies, lower than any of the MCU's movies. Long story short, I think Disney got a little too eager with their new shiny toy. Man, they really should have spaced out these movies. They just blew through 5 of their biggest titles in 1 year. Should have started off 2019 with, Oliver and Company. Anyway, so now we're suffering this trend of what's being called photorealistic remakes, which is a term simply to appease all the animation Twitter folks who said, "It's not live action." Disney doesn't want you to think of these films as animated because they know they're banking 100% on the realism aspect. The primary demographic for these films is people who think animated things are inferior to movies that are real. Which, come on, people, movies aren't real, right? Disney is appealing to these consumers, but appeasing the critical community by referring to these films as photorealistic. But I want to replace this term. I don't think it's an accurate term, so let's get into that. Chapter 1. Photorealism. I don't think photorealism is the right word here. I'm going to propose that we instead refer to it as hyperrealism, and I'm going to explain why. A couple articles have already opted to use the word hyperrealism, and I'm definitely on board with that, because these movies do not look real. The images have this more realistic than realistic quality to them, like how movie posters have been looking for the last, 15, 20 years. Nothing quite feels natural. And also there's this weird lack of motion blur that makes it feel like you're watching something that was filmed at 48 frames a second. If you're unfamiliar, the higher the frame rate something is, the less motion blur that gets created. This is because the amount of time that the shutter is open to capture a single image is shortened, and thus less motion is captured per frame, which is to say less blur. This movie is rendered at 24 frames a second, but with only just enough motion blur to make it look passable. Not enough motion blur to make it look realistic. For instance, this shot right here, the camera moves pretty fast. All of the objects in this scene should be blurry because of the motion, even if ever so slightly. I found some comparable shots in these other films where the camera moves at pretty much the same speed, and you'll notice just a slight fuzz around all the objects. Now, you will notice a lot of motion blur down here, where the characters are moving a lot. In fact, there's motion blur in almost every single shot. But the problem is that there's not enough motion blur. Everything feels stiff. It's just like whoever rendered these animals was so proud of their work that they wanted to make sure you saw every detail without any blurriness to distract you from their awesome 3D sculpt of a giraffe. I mean, I get it. I've been there. It sucks to work so hard on something only to cover it up with effects and interpolation and blurriness. But in the case of this movie, which is aiming to be realistic, it just contributes to this unnatural vibe that I get. Now, to be totally fair, this is from a preview. Who's to say what the finished scene will look like when the film is released? In this scene, from later, the motion blur seems to be used a little bit more effectively, but we'll talk about that one in a second. First, we need to look at the Hakuna Matata scene that was revealed on Jimmy Kimmel. This lion doesn't weigh enough. No, I'm not body shaming here. I mean, his shape is fine. What I mean is, he doesn't move like a 500-pound lion. He moves around like a trapeze artist, barely having any impact when he hits the ground. You really expect me to believe a 500-pound lion hitting the ground with full force and coming to a complete stop only compresses a couple inches? I mean, I'm sure this lion has some amount of control over his body and can maybe sustain that impact, but give us one or the other. He should either compress to absorb the impact and slow down, or his forward momentum should carry forward after his front legs hit the ground and stop. There's a little bit of forward momentum here, so he does readjust his front legs to counteract, but this is undermined by the back legs, which hit the ground without any compression to absorb impact and zero forward momentum. It's really hard to find any footage of a lion doing this action, because this isn't typically something lions would do. Most of the footage I found of lions doing this leap is when they're sprinting, and there's pretty minimal up and down during a sprint because all the momentum is forward. Now, Timon and Pumbaa, on the other hand, are way less offensive to look at. That doesn't mean they're excused from criticism, but I'm not going to go into detail about this scene. In fact, since they were the only characters to get a full speaking scene released before the film, we're going to endlessly nitpick their behaviors from that scene. So, Chapter 2. Okay, so another thing that weirds me out about this Lion King movie is the way that our characters act. I know lots of people are talking about how realistic and believable everything is, but there's just something off about the way these characters behave. There's an attempt here for character action to be faithful to their real animal counterparts, but here's the problem. These characters are not real animals. Well, yes, obviously they're not real animals. You can't train a bunch of lions to act together, although that would be awesome. No, what I'm saying is these characters do not behave the same way that real animals would behave. And I know that sounds useless to even point out, but here's the reason I'm bringing it up. If your characters are going to look as realistic as possible, but they fall into the uncanny valley when it comes to their movements, you've kind of defeated the point of making your characters look hyper-realistic. I mean, I'm willing to admit that some of these images look decent on their own, but it falls apart in the motion. I've already pointed out the weird lack of motion blur, but there's more to it than that. Look at the way Pumbaa leans his head down first before leaning down with his full upper body. Ignoring the fact that a pig would never get down on his wrists like that, it's just a perfect example of like classic Disney animation. The head moves first, and the body follows through. The weird part is that these characters adhere to this Disney-esque style of acting only some of the time, while the rest of the time they're following behaviors more akin to their real-life animal counterparts. Later, in the same scene, Pumbaa turns around much like an excited puppy. Now, obviously, I can't say dogs and pigs are exactly the same, but look at this real dog spinning in circles. Real animals have very little control over their bodies. While Pumbaa has lots of control over his body, he's able to come to an abrupt stop after exactly one rotation, which is fine when you're a cartoon character or a trapeze artist, but this is supposed to be a realistic impersonation of a hog. In fact, Simba does it too. If this is supposed to be realistic, why are all the animals doing this two-step spin maneuver that dogs like to do? I mean, I can't say hogs and lions don't move like this, but I haven't encountered any footage of them doing it in the wild. And if you're thinking, oh, well, that's fine, it's just a subtle artistic embellishment, then my question is, why couldn't they embellish everything a little bit further? They've added all these little quirks to emulate real-life hogs, like the stiffness of his legs, the trotting motion that he relies on, the subtle tail wagging, but they don't push the acting far enough. To me, it feels like it falls into this weird middle ground of not quite realistic, but not quite animated. And this isn't the only aspect of the film that falls into that middle ground, but we'll get into that later. Take this side-by-side comparison, Rafiki breaking open a piece of flora. In the original, Rafiki has a delicate anticipation before passionately breaking it open, showing us his character in a simple 2 seconds of animation. In the 2019 version, he breaks a couple roots pretty much exactly the way I would expect a real monkey to break something. I mean, it looks like when that kid remade Toy Story using real toys. It's one of the more realistic examples of animation I could find in all the promotional material for the movie, and it's just boring. So boring. What does this animation tell us about Rafiki's character? It tells us that he's a monkey. Well, thanks for communicating that crucial bit of information to us. I'd hate to see this iconic moment used to tell the audience something integral about Rafiki's character, like his reverence for the king, or his free spirit attitude. Just make sure he acts like a monkey. From what I can tell, they've completely eliminated all the personality from Rafiki's character, I guess because that's the era we're living in now. I mean, Christ, even Superman is getting in on the no personality thing. Now, what I really want to emphasize about the acting is this. I couldn't find the clip of him saying it, but Richard Williams has talked about how rotoscoping, which is to say tracing over video footage, leads to a lack of believability in the final animation. In one of the earliest examples of rotoscoping, Snow White, we see that she occasionally takes on this floaty quality. The solution, as Williams suggests it, is to emphasize the extreme positions, the anticipations, the contact poses. This makes the movement pop just enough that the eye finds the motion appealing and believable. And sure, this primarily applies to 2D, but I do think it applies in the case of this photorealistic animation as well. I think some of this motion would have benefited from just a little bit of emphasis. If you push the poses a little further, you can make them feel stronger, and thus improve the performances. Chapter 3. Facial Expressions. These characters are just so lifeless and dull. You could at least animate the eyebrows a little bit. None of these characters are capable of expressing emotion on their face. What are these two animals feeling right now? Look at Simba here versus him here. Can you guess what Simba is feeling in either of these? Can you even tell the difference between the two? Because I can't. This one on the left is from the scene where he talks to Zazu, and this one on the right is when Scar scares him into fleeing. These are the correlating shots from the original film. Now again, I hate to keep comparing and saying that the original is better, but at least I can tell what my protagonist is feeling without having to be told. And don't you dare say that it's unrealistic. Real animals can convey a much wider array of facial expressions. The animators of this film seem to be relying a lot on the ears to do all the heavy lifting, but won't use the eyebrows or the other features. These aspects of a creature's face can be used to great effect. Research on wolves in captivity recently found that wolves in particular do a lot of communication with their faces. I mean, look at these puppers. Each one in this image has a different expression, and it doesn't take long for our human brains to read these expressions. If you're going to make the characters behave like dogs, at least give them the facial mobility of a wolf. I guess that brings us back to the Hakuna Matata scene. Now, I get a lot of people are okay with this scene. I guess for your average moviegoer, having the characters on screen and hearing the voices is enough. After all, how often do you hear people talk about how Robin Williams did the most amazing job as the genie, but never mention the animators who brought that character to life? All they really need to form the emotional connection is the voice, and the images are secondary. Are these people wrong? No, not technically, but yeah, they are. They're fucking wrong. They're just not engaging with the movie to the fullest extent. I mean, they're pretty much mindlessly watching whatever's sat in front of them. Now, myself personally, I find it impossible to believe this scene. It doesn't feel like these characters are singing together. I can't form an emotional connection to these lifeless animals. In the original, the characters feel like they are singing. Plus, this scene is full of small little moments like this, where Pumbaa does a perfect 10 out of 10 dive with no splash. The animation is so full of life. These singing animals have a double bounce on their back legs as they walk away. These singing animals move their heads a little bit. Anyway, time to talk about lips.
'Cause I love my lips!
The worst offender here is the Hakuna Matata scene, so I guess we're back here again. Characters need human lips to be readable. Historically, animated characters pretty much across the board have human lips. Regardless of what kind of teeth or how many or what shape their jowls are, they all make the same motions. They all look like this when they make an sound, and they all look like this when they make an sound, despite the fact that none of these animals would have the muscles necessary to make these shapes. Now, because of the lion's limited physiology, the animators on Lion King 2019 were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either give the characters human lips, which would have been glorious and horrifying, or severely limit the available lip action to each character based on their model. Now, obviously they went with the second option, the cowards. However, while this choice does fall in line with their push for, realism or whatever, it unfortunately doesn't mesh with the fact that this movie is a musical. I mean, even if everything else was perfect, they still had to choose between karaoke lips and the lips that they use in Charlotte's Web and pretty much every other live-action movie about talking animals. At the end of the day, karaoke lips are just more interesting to look at. They feel more alive. They just work better. Now, I thought about comparing this movie to Detective Pikachu and the trailer for Sonic, other contemporary movies with creatures. However, that's not entirely fair because neither of those movies prominently feature characters singing, so they can get away with more subtle lip action. No, we need to go back further. We need to go back to Alvin and the Chipmunks. A pretty pandery and unengaging film, but hey, it spawned 3 sequels, so how bad could it be?
I don't want to come home and find a bunch of rabbits and skunks on my couch.
Filthy creatures, Dave. Never associate with them.
Wait, what? What did he just say? Is Alvin racist against the other woodland creatures? Or is he looking down on them for their inferior intelligence? Wow, there is a lot to unpack here. We might have to do a deep dive into that film later. Anyway, I looked through the comments, the reviews. At the time, people responded by calling the CGI in the film mediocre. It definitely doesn't hold up today, and neither do any of the sequels, but I think in particular, these comments reference the quality of rendering and compositing as opposed to the quality of animation. There's definitely no comments about how it didn't feel like the chipmunks were actually singing, and I think it's fair to compare these singing animals to these singing animals. So what did they do differently? Well, they used human lips. While it certainly doesn't look realistic in the objective sense, it feels more realistic in the motion. It feels like these creatures are singing. Sacrificing realism is a small price to pay for believability, but it seems Jon Favreau disagrees with me there. Speaking of that guy, Chapter 5, Color. Does Jon Favreau just not care about color or something? I mean, looking back at his filmography, I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that he doesn't. Other essayists have already discussed the color grading of the MCU, which kicked off with Favreau's Iron Man and Iron Man 2. And then we got The Jungle Book. And now The Lion King looks lifeless and dull for basically no reason. I mean, other live-action remakes have better color. Maleficent has better color. Even the fucking live-action Dora movie has a better color palette than this. I'm not saying Dora looks good, but geez, at least they're using their colors effectively. This movie sucks all the life out of the scenes that it wants to recreate. All these beautiful color palettes are replaced with gray, dark gray, muted colors. Some of these images are just so gross to look at, and there's no reason for them to look this bland. Everyone keeps touting how realistic this movie is, but I just don't see it. Nature has way more colorful and interesting environments than what we're presented with here. I mean, do I really need to bust out Planet Earth to demonstrate just how colorful nature can be? I mean, sure, the film isn't exactly monochromatic, but again, it's not dynamic enough to be considered realistic. All these images end up in this awkward middle ground between realism and cartoonish exaggeration. It can't decide what it wants to be. So not only is the original film way more colorful, but real life is way more colorful, so what's exactly the purpose of all these muted colors? I guess it just falls in line with all the other gritty reboots of the past decade. Is it really appropriate for a movie about singing lions? No, but I guess that's where we're at. I just hope Favreau doesn't end up directing Lilo and Stitch. Jesus, I'm just picturing the scene at the beginning of that movie where Stitch crashes at night and it starts raining.
Tell me, do you bleed?
I guess we really shouldn't have expected Lion King to look any different than Favreau's last movie, The Jungle Book. I mean, look at these scenes. What is this, The Deathly Hallows Part 2? And since we're being nitpicky, I'm gonna go ahead and nitpick this scene right here. Am I the only one bothered by their decision to completely silhouette the characters in this third shot? I mean, the shot looks fine in isolation, but this is part of a 3-stage crossfade sequence, where we see Simba growing up. Now, I'm not saying it needs to look exactly like the original. Obviously, the original is better, but they're free to make whatever changes they want as long as they're good changes. In fact, they don't even need to be good changes, they just need to be not bad changes. However, there's not enough change in silhouette between here and here that I think this really reads right off the bat. Not to mention they establish a pattern of 2 daylight scenes, and then immediately break the pattern by having a scene at night, which is completely dark. If you're gonna break pattern like that, there should at least be enough consistency in all 3 shots that it's not distracting. Meaning I should at least be able to make out some detail on the characters here, because I could make out detail on the first 2. The reason this doesn't work is because when your eye processes 2 similar images in a row, it's immediately going to start picking out the changes. It's playing spot the difference. When the scene goes from green to dark purple, and the characters go from light to completely dark, then that's the first thing your eye picks up on. It probably hardly notices the fact that Simba has increased in size over here. In fact, they're deliberately relying on the audience remembering the original scene in order to quickly understand what this montage is representing. If you've never seen The Lion King before, then it's not immediately obvious that Simba is now a grown adult. You either have to stop and think about it, which takes you out of the movie, or you just miss that detail and then you get taken by surprise in the next shot where Simba suddenly has a full mane, which, would probably also take you out of the movie. Anyway, I think the blandness and unwarranted darkness of these images kind of speaks for itself, so we're going to move on. Conclusion: who cares? So what's the point of all this? Sure, a bunch of people don't like how these new films look, but why does that matter? Every film has a substantial group of people that adamantly dislike it. How is The Lion King any different? I just spent 15 minutes complaining about minor aspects of the film's aesthetic. But in reality, the reason we're out here pointing out details that seem insignificant to most, like the color and the acting, is that sometimes it's hard to articulate what we really want to say about a film. Sometimes animators just look at a film and have a gut reaction. We think to ourselves, hey, that doesn't feel right, and we try to find specific examples to demonstrate why it doesn't feel right, but that's only an attempt to try to explain something that can't be put into words. What are we really saying? Well, this film lacks a soul. It's difficult for an audience to grok these characters because of their wishy-washy direction, lifeless movement, and hyper-real image quality. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, it's a corporate product designed to activate your nostalgia. This 2019 film certainly wouldn't be making millions of dollars if The Lion King wasn't one of the most successful movies of all time. I mean, can you imagine a world where The Lion King didn't already exist? And then Jon Favreau comes to Disney and says, hey, I want to make this movie about singing lions. Oh, and there's hyenas, and a meerkat and a pig who are best friends. And Disney says, oh, okay, so you want to make like Sing? Like Zootopia, but with musical numbers? And Jon Favreau goes, no, I want it to be like, like Avatar. Like, I want to spend $200 million on cutting-edge special effects to make the most realistic-looking animals possible. I mean, really, would anyone go see that movie? No, of course not. It's a pointless and insulting rehash of a colorful, vibrant film. It fails not only to recapture the essence of the original film, but also to build upon it in any meaningful way. It doesn't have the courage to make any strong stylistic decisions of its own, instead relying on the imagery of the past. This film, Lion King 2019, does not contribute anything to culture. It's a cultural leech, although I'm not sure I expected anything else from a $200 million corporate product. So at the end of the day, I guess we vote with our wallets. Unfortunately, the early trailers carefully avoided showing us anything involving singing or dialogue or characters doing anything with their mouths. So they managed to trick everyone into thinking this movie wouldn't fall face first into the uncanny valley like poor old Grand Moff Tarkin. They basically deceived everyone long enough to generate enough hype that it wouldn't affect their box office. And after all, it has Beyonce in it. So this movie will probably have a field day at the box office, which means we can look forward to all these pointless remakes for a long, long time. And I'm already tired of it. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Make sure you leave a comment and let me know what you thought. If you want to see more content like this in the future, go ahead and subscribe, and you can also support us on Patreon if you want to expedite the process of me making more content.